Thank you, Laura, for that kind introduction, and thank you for those of you listening in today. As noted, the title of my talk is The Extraction of Pesticides from Difficult Food Matrices. As I go through this talk, I am going to talk about the traditional QUECHERS extraction of pesticides from food matrices and compare that to a new technology, the EDGE. And what I hope you gain is that you see that the EDGE is not only applicable to those standard matrices in which QUECHERS was developed, but also applies to some of the more difficult food matrices where QUECHERS may not be as optimal. So with that, let's get into the presentation and talk about the application and why we're so concerned about this sector of pesticides in our food. So pesticides are necessary. They help us control insects, rodents, weeds, bacteria, mold, and fungus. And in a very populated world in which we need to feed, pesticides are necessary. They've done a lot of good. But there's also this counterpart where there's concerns from a safety perspective on health and to our environment. And there are 900 regulated pesticides, or more than that actually, in this world. So this is a very daunting application that we have to look at. Last year, I was at the European Pesticide Residue Workshop in Munich, and during one of the question and answer sessions, somebody said, will we ever see the light at the end of the tunnel? And I think a lot of us in that room maybe resonate a little bit because it does seem overwhelming at times with such a big sector of so many different pesticides, so many different concerns, so many different food stuff. However, I believe in the chemical residue community. I have seen amazing strides. Development of QUECHERS was one of them. And I believe that we'll continue to move forward to keep up with this ever-changing world of pesticides. And what I hope you see is the EDGE is just another step in that direction, helping us so that we are on top of this very challenging topic. So in our lab, we have a Waters Acuity UPLC and a Zevo TQG mass spec. So I'm often on the Waters website looking for application notes. And so I just did a search for those that related to pesticides and saw that 217 application notes referred back to pesticides. And that's a lot. It just shows you how much research, and this is just one company. I'm sure all the other analytical companies out there have done just as much work in this sector. And then if you look at how many of those referred back to QUECHERS, it was just about nearly a little bit under half of them referred to QUECHERS. So basically, if the sample preparation was noted, it was QUECHERS. So I recognize that primarily in this extracting pesticides from foods, the method that people are using is the QUECHERS method. So I certainly am going to pay attention to that in this presentation as I talk about an alternative to that QUECHERS method. So now that we've kind of looked at how pesticides are indeed a very hot topic that is ever-changing in our world today, let's take a broader look at sample preparation as a whole. Because this is a pie graph from LCGC magazine a few years ago, and it is staggering to see that 62% of our time is still spent on sample preparation. In the last couple of decades, we have made tremendous strides as far as the analysis is concerned with UPLC and high-resolution mass specs. We've really optimized that sector, and we're really doing analysis very quickly and accurately in today's world. But we really haven't made those huge strides in the area of sample preparation. I have listed here just a few techniques. It is certainly not exhaustive, and I recognize that all of them may not be very applicable to this topic as a whole, but this is kind of some of the big sectors we're doing in sample preparation today. And if you look at it, Soxhlet stands out to me. That's a technique that has been around for 125 years. And you're seeing it so much in today's labs. So there's just an opportunity, I think, to modernize the sector of sample preparation as a whole. And I really feel that the EDGE does that. But I recognize that for this talk, the applicable technique we're talking about is QUECHERS. And I fully understand the allure of QUECHERS. Any technique that is multi-residue multi-matrix is certainly appealing. I mean, it's applicable to so many different things. So I fully understand why QUECHERS took off as it did. But as a whole, it's still a manual process, and I still think there's a lot of opportunity to improve and modernize upon that technique. Again, the limitations I've listed here are kind of an exhaustive list for sample preparation as a whole, but so many of them, I believe, refer back to QUECHERS in general. Time-consuming. The technician is having to do all those steps. I do feel that QUECHERS is taking a lot of our time in our lab. Costly. Those QUECHERS kits tend to add up. That cost per test is significant. It's something that we shouldn't look past. And then again, it's a manual method that can be very tedious in that sample preparation. So I feel that there's room for improvement. And so as introducing the EDGE, I hope you see that answers a lot of these limitations that we have here. So I'm a very visual person. You'll see a lot of pictures throughout this presentation. And so what I'm going to do now is walk you through a video because I want you to understand what I'm talking about. I want you to see the EDGE. I want you to understand how it works, how it runs, so you have that picture in your head as we go through the methods and the data. The EDGE at its heart is a new technology. It combines the processes of pressurized fluid extraction and dispersive solid phase extraction into one. So as this video plays here, I want you to note that this is happening in real time. The EDGE is capable of running as fast as it is depicted here in this video. So you're watching one of our chemists here in our lab, Brittany, prepare the Q cup. She put in a Q disc that enables our filtration, and then assembled the Q cup, which is our sample holder, and then put our sample in. The Q cup is very light. It can go directly on an analytical balance. You can weigh directly into that. Our racks are easily exchangeable, so you can be preparing 12 samples on one as 12 are running in another. And just a few clicks, your run is running, and then the EDGE is going to take over from there. Brittany could almost do this faster than I could explain what she was doing. The Q cup is then going to be loaded into the chamber. You see the automation taking care of that. And then our pressure seal is going to come down, creating a pressurized environment. This is now a picture of the cross-section of that cell. It's going to add solvent from both the bottom and that top. That bottom add is crucial because it creates this gap of solvent on the outside of the cell. As we begin to heat or create a pressure differential, that solvent on the outside of the cell is going to disperse up through the Q disc into the sample, creating a dispersive effect, which aids in the efficiency of the extraction. As soon as temperature is reached and or hold time, our extract is then going to drain through the Q disc enabling filtration and the cooling coil, which is going to bring it down to room temperature, and then collect it in a vial. We then add a rinse. This is just clean solvent that's going to run through the sample to just make sure we get everything out and get good recoveries and everything's collected. I recognize that in a system that runs samples in series, as the EDGE does, you have to be cognitive of carryover. So we are going to then do a wash where we wash the entire fluidic pathway with solvent to ensure that no carryover is going to occur. So as we go back to the picture of the EDGE here, it is just have removed that Q cup from the chamber. So it takes that Q cup out, and then it's going to go back into our waste port so that we can do our washing. So that's what it's doing now. Our wash parameters are extremely flexible. You have control over number of washes, solvent volume, hold time. You can even add temperature. So you really can ensure that you are going to make sure that carryover is not a concern. So our extraction's done. Okay, guys, it's that quick. And you could be taking your extract and ready to go to analysis. But what Brittany is showing here is just a really nice thing about the EDGE is you have immediate access to your extracted sample as well. And that's always so dry, which just gives you that feel-good feeling you probably got a good extraction. And then you got your extract, which is nice and clear and filtered and ready to go to analysis. So with that, I really hope you've seen now this visual of the EDGE and how it works. So let's go back to the application. So we talked about how many pesticides, over 900, that we have to be concerned about. But I didn't hit too much on the different varieties of food. So this even further complicates this problem. You have different types of food stuff pictured here where you have celery that has a lot of water content. You have honey that is very high in sugar. You have a dry sample in rice. You have oranges, which are acidic, nuts that have a fat content, and spinach with pigment. And each of these different types of matrices propose their own challenges when extracting the pesticides. They're all going to have different matrix effects. And while QUECHERS was developed for matrices such as spinach and celery, often you have to do some sort of modification to the QUECHERS method to adhere to some of the other more complicated matrices out there. So there's just an opportunity here to have a one method in which you don't have to modify that works for all different types of foodstuff. Another sector of difficult types of matrices is spices in general. So this is going to be what the focus of this talk is. Primarily, most of the data we're going to talk about are extraction of these 4 spices: black pepper, oregano, cinnamon, and paprika. And spices, even furthermore than the food stuff we just looked at, adds in extra complexity because they go through some extra processing to get to that dry substance that we're purchasing in our grocery stores. So just they have more opportunity to be exposed to contaminants. And then they're just in general known to be difficult matrices. To make this a little bit more relatable, I have a reference listed there at the bottom of the screen, and this is just one paper out of many out there. But in this paper, they looked at a number of different spices and over 100 pesticides they were looking for, and what they found was that 59% of the spices they looked at had pesticides in them. And even more concerning than that was specifically oregano. 10% of the oregano looked at had pesticides higher that were at higher than the maximum residue limits. So those MRL limits are something we use from a worldwide perspective to make sure that our food stuff is safe. But here in the study, they're seeing that they saw pesticides over those limits. So that just kind of brings home the fact that this is an important topic, specifically to spices alone, and that this should be something we're looking into because it affects us. Not only do we care about it as chemists, but as consumers as well. So let's talk about the QUECHERS method first, and then we'll move in and talk about the EDGE method. So what's depicted here is just the standard AOAC method for QUECHERS, and it's a pretty straightforward process. You're going to combine your salts and your sample and your solvent into one tube. You're going to shake that tube, then centrifuge. Then you're going to take off that little bit of that top layer, transfer it to a dispersive SBE tube, shake it, centrifuge it, and then take your sample off there and go to analysis. The process is very manual. There's a lot of different steps to it, as you can see, and you generate a fair amount of waste throughout that process, too, with the different types of centrifuge tubes you have to use and pipettes and so forth. So it's just, again, it's a tedious process that takes a lot of time from the technician that's running this. And can be, at least according to my chemists in our lab, a little bit frustrating to run. So now this is just a standard method. So let's take a look at the method we ran for the spices, because as I mentioned when I was talking about the difficult food matrices, you often have to make some modifications to the QUECHERS method in order for it to be optimal for what you're looking at. And in this case, we based our method off of an adjuvant application note that we found for the extraction of pesticides from spices. So this method is pretty much the standard AOAC method except for 2 major changes, and those are highlighted. First, we needed to take that sample size down. So the AOAC method was developed for sample sizes of 10 to 15 grams. 10 to 15 grams of a spice is just simply not applicable to run. So we need to take that sample size down to really make it work. So that's one of the modifications we need to make in this case. And then second, water is crucial to the QUECHERS process. that extraction is occurring because there's that interaction between the water and the organic layer and that salt partitioning. So that's kind of aiding the extraction process. Well, spices are dry, so you need to add water into them in order for the extraction to be efficient. So we're going to add 10 mils of water, shake it for 30 seconds, and then let that stand for 30 minutes to really thoroughly wet that sample. And then everything else we're going to do, like I said, is the standard QUECHERS methods. This is what we ran in our lab. This entire process took us over an hour to complete for the samples. So with that in mind, again, I love pictures, so let's look at the actual extracts that we ran. So again, the 4 spices we looked at were black pepper, cinnamon, oregano, and paprika. And I don't know about you, but when I look at this picture, it just looks complicated, right? There's a lot going on. It's messy. I understand that this is what QUECHERS should look like, but it's just kind of that take-home that maybe we can modernize this process. One of the things that we've noted in our lab is that centrifuge tubes are just notorious for leaking. So as you're doing that shaking process, if you have any leaking going on there, I mean, you're losing your sample at that point. And then if you kind of look at that oregano sample there, you kind of see that some of it's up on the side of that. And that's even after, 10 minutes of centrifuging that process there. So, there's a lot going on here. And the next step that you need to do is to take a mill and then move on over to the dispersive SP step. So if we zoom in on the paprika extract here, you can see how that's not trivial to be able to get a mill off of this and then move on to the next step. And keep in mind, this is for that small sample size of 2 grams. If we had ran 10 to 15 grams of the paprika here, we certainly would have nothing to work with. We wouldn't be able to have anything we'd be able to move over to the next step on. So again, there's just, there's room for improvement just from a process alone. And then we'll talk about data later on. So if we kind of compare this to what you're able to get on the edge, I don't know about you, but that extract on the edge there on the right, just so much nice and cleaner, right? Clear, nice extract. And keep in mind, it took us nearly an hour to get to the step that is pictured there for the QUECHERS. And 7 minutes, we had that extract on the edge. So it's not only we're offering a rapid, simple, and efficient method here in comparison to the QUECHERS method. So I just think from a visual perspective, it's really appealing. And as we continue on, hopefully we'll even see that the data also is really nice as well. So with that, I'm going to dig in a little bit deeper into the EDGE method. So from a broad perspective, the EDGE is simple in setup, and I'm going to walk you through everything from start to finish, because I want you to be able to refer back to these slides and run exactly what I've told you about, that, just even from this presentation alone, realize the simplicity of running the EDGE. So we'll get into details on that. And then the extraction, like I said, in this case for the pesticides, we're doing a 7-minute run, so less than 10 minutes there. I will note that this is solvent extraction. So we are using, including washing, around 50 mils of solvent. And I recognize that that is more solvent than the QUECHERS method. However, it is significantly less solvent than other techniques we might be comparing to. And later on in the presentation, I'll address that extra solvent and how we deal with that. Precise control of temperature is key. I know for a lot of you guys listening, you're probably thinking pesticides and temperature. No, this is not good, and you'd be right. Certain pesticides do not lend themselves to higher temperatures. You certainly are going to see a drop-off of recovery if you use high temperatures. So I want you to know that temperature is only an option on the EDGE. It is not required. So you can run at room temperature if you would like. For our method, we are going to heat slightly to 40 degrees C, but that again, it's an option. So that's up to your discretion on what you run there. And then efficient extraction. It's an automated system. So we are eliminating the human aspect here. So we're making a really nice, clean, efficient process that is going on. So let's dive into the details of the actual method and how we'd assemble everything. So the first thing you have to do is assemble the Q cup. And so I want to dive in a little bit deeper here on the Q discs themselves. So the Q disc that we recommend for this particular application is our G1 Q disc. This is a glass fiber Q disc that filters at sub 0.5 microns, so you can go directly to analysis. But as you see there, it's not just the G1 I have pictured, but two C9s, and a C9 is a cellulose Q disc. Here at CM, we offer a wide variety of different types of Q discs at different types of materials and porosities. The reason we are using the C9s in this case is to add support to that G1 Q disc. We have a very robust set of filtration going on. If you can kind of go back to all of those types of food stuff we looked at, from the nuts to the honey and so forth, you can see that the food varies dramatically from dry to wet. So we're dealing with a lot of different types of foods, and so we want to make this as simple as possible. So we're going to recommend one Q-disc combination that's going to hold up to everything. So this is just one really robust way to ensure that you're going to have good filtration. And I want you to note, we're not going to upcharge for those extra discs. So regardless of what you're using to filter, it's going to be one low cost of less than $1 per test. So don't worry about that as well. We're going to throw in those C9s if needed in running the G1 Q disc. So back to the assembly. So we're going to create that sandwich of those 3 Q discs, and then we're going to put that at the bottom of our the bottom cap to our Q cup. And then that bottom cap we're just going to simply screw on to the bottom of the cup. This has been designed so that it cannot be cross-threaded, so you cannot mess this up. It is just one simple, easy turn, and you're good to go. So once you've assembled your Q cup, then you can put your Q cup directly on the analytical balance. And in this case, we're going to weigh 2 grams of the spice into the Q cup. I want to note, we're not doing any sort of cleanup for our edge extraction in this study. Okay, we wanted to keep it as simple as possible. So no cleanup. We're just simply putting directly in the 2 grams of spice. We're then spiking with ResTech multi-residue pesticide standards. We're mixing up a combination of 4, which puts us just under 60 pesticides that we are looking at for this study. And then we're going to let that stand 30 minutes before running the extraction. If we look at the now the actual method, and what I've got depicted here is the cross section of the Q cup in the chamber there, similar to what you saw in the video. That really kind of hopefully gives you a visual of what's going on in that cell. So we are going to use the exact same solvent that is used in QUECHERS. So that 1% acetic acid and acetonitrile, so that keeps that simple. We're going to use the same solvent. We're going to do 15 milliliter top volume add, and then we're going to do a 10 milliliter bottom volume add of that. And remember, that bottom volume add is what's giving you that dispersive effect. As I noted before, we're going to heat this to 40 degrees C. We're doing a 2 gram sample size, and we have that Q disc of that G1 sandwich with the C9s. In any situation where you're running a lower temperature, you want to make sure you're doing a hold time. So in this case, we're going to implement a 3-minute hold time just to make sure you're giving optimal time to run that extraction. We're then going to do a 5 ml rinse in this case. Again, that's that clean solvent that just comes through to ensure good recoveries and get every last little bit out. So in total, that's a 30 milliliter extraction that we're doing, and then we're going to wash with an additional 20 milliliters to ensure that there is no carryover. So now we've got our extract. So you run this method, 7 minutes later, you've got your extract, and this is what it's going to look like. So this is just black pepper represented here in this picture. So I want to make a note here that when you move on to the analysis step, you need to know what your volume is. and there may be some minor loss of solvent during the extraction process. So you're either going to want to dilute up to a known volume or concentrate down to a known volume. At CM, we do offer graduated vials. So if you did so desire, you could run in that graduated vial, and then on the 30 ml mark, you could just dilute up to that mark to just ensure that you did indeed have your 30 mils. We also have a line at 5 mils as well. So in this case, we actually concentrated down to 5 mils. So you could use the graduations for that as well. It depends on the sensitivity of your analytical instrument, what concentration you want to run at. So in this particular case, at the concentration we spiked at, that 30 mil extract would be around 33 ppb. So if you're okay with just wanting to look at that, you could go direct to analysis at that case. And in our situation, we desired to move to concentrate down to that 5 mil mark and then go to analysis from there. I want to note, though, that the time it took us to do this evaporation step was total in time, less time that it took us to do the entire QUECHERS method. So we were able to do the extraction on the edge and do the concentration, which, you know, removing acetonitrile is not trivial. That takes some time, faster than it took us to do the prep for the QUECHERS. And again, that moving from the edge, which is automated, to the concentration, which is also automated and no transfer of solvent, it's one very simple, efficient process. So again, I love pictures, so let's look at some pretty pictures. You know, spices definitely lended themselves to really nice-looking extracts and smelled good too. So we're looking here at black pepper, oregano, paprika, cinnamon, and what you see here are just really nice, clean extracts that can go direct to analysis. And if we zoom in on the concentration step, we still see we get nice, clean, clear extracts to be able to go to analysis. I will note again, we're not doing any cleanup here. So this is the extraction with no cleanup whatsoever. So they look really good. So now that we've got our extract and we've concentrated down to 5 mils, we're going to now go to analysis. So again, I want to give you all the details so you can go back and you can run this. As already noted, we have a water system in our lab, and so that's pictured there because, again, I like pictures. This is our actual unit. So this is what generated all this data we're looking at here today. And we ran a ResTech column, and we were also spiking with ResTech standards, and we based this method off of a ResTech application note. We did a 10 milliliter injection. Our column temperature was 50 degrees C, and we did a gradient of water to methanol. What I want to point out here is this method in total time is just under 10 minutes. So think about that. We've got a 7-minute extraction, 10-minute analysis time, so that in less than 20 minutes, we have data. The edge really lends itself to R&D type situations because you can so quickly test something. You know, you can look at that data, go make a quick tweak, and then, 20 minutes later, have some information on how that worked. So it's just another advantage to running the edge. What I have pictured here is just a chromatogram. Now, I recognize we spiked with a lot of pesticides, right? And this is not everything here. But I just didn't want to show you a mess of peaks. I wanted you to be able to see peak shapes and see that we get good chromatography. So here's just a subset of some of the pesticides that we're looking at here today. And we did MRM transitions to both identify and quantify the pesticides. So I hope up to this point, I've told you guys a good story, showing you some pretty pictures. But until we look at data, it's just a story, right? So we need to put some merit to that story, and so that it's believable and you understand, the data to back it up. So let's move on to looking at some data. So I'm going to start by looking at a specific pesticide to just make it really relatable. So this is an insecticide. Monocrotophos is currently banned in the United States because it's known as an acute toxin, but it's commonly used in India. And that's applicable because India is the largest exporter of paprika and black pepper in our world. And so what that kind of just brings home is that we need to be not only concerned about what's going on with our own borders, but what's going on as a world as a whole, because we export and import so many of our food stuff. And so there's just this need for harmonizing everything going on. And I know in the chemical residue community, they're making great strides towards harmonizing these efforts. And, that's just yet another extremely daunting task. But I've been really encouraged in the direction that we're going. So we're definitely making strides towards that. But again, I digress a little bit talking about data here. And so here are the 4 spices that we looked at and the edge recovery data for those 4 spices for this particular insecticide. And you can see that we get good recovery across the board. But this is just one little insecticide. We want to look at a larger subset of data. So what I've done is pulled out a list of fungicides here. Again, I didn't want to just overwhelm you with a graph of everything we looked at and not even be able to read the numbers or anything. I want you to see this data. I want you to see what we're getting and what we're doing. So just kind of pick this group of fungicides to zone in on and look at. And our goal in our lab, as we're looking at our extraction efficiencies, is to be within 70 to 130% recovery and to have RSD values less than 15%. And across the board, we were able to achieve that with this study. So we were really pleased with these results. So before I move on to other data, I do again want to make it a little bit relatable. So again, this is kind of a random or just kind of more, I pulled out the fungicides, so didn't really know too much about these different fungicides, but as I researched them a little bit more, 3 of these were ones of concern. So the flucilazole causes possible birth defects. The pencycuron is a acute toxin, and the tebuconazole is a possible carcinogen. So just here, fairly small set of fungicides here, and 3 of them are ones that have potential health concerns. So that just brings in that reason of why this is a big topic. There's a lot going on here, and there's a lot to research still to be done and interest out there. So, but I've only looked at edge data, right? And we've obviously talked a lot about QUECHERS as well. So let's look at the comparison data to QUECHERS. And the reality was that when we looked at that data for QUECHERS, that we just did significantly better on the edge. And this is taking into consideration that we did that modified QUECHERS method. So we did everything we could to ensure that we were doing the best QUECHERS method for these spices. And we were still able to see significantly improved results, about 30% better in recovery when running the edge versus the QUECHERS method. And if we move on to the other 2 spices we looked at, black pepper and oregano, we see the same story. So what I hope you see here is that in the edge, we not only offer you a simple, rapid, and efficient method for this, so you get all of those benefits, but furthermore, you get better data. You're getting better recovery values for this difficult matrix set of spices. So I would be remiss, though, as you're looking at this set of data, to not point out the fact that I recognize, even for our oregano data, that our values are a little bit lower than we were for some of the other spices we are looking at. So for the black pepper and paprika and cinnamon, our average recovery was in the 90s. However, for oregano, that's more in the 80s. So I see that even with that, there is room for improvement. Now, I want to bring back the fact that we did not do any sort of cleanup in this particular study. So I'm going to draw a little bit of an analogy here. So here in North Carolina, that's where I'm currently at. I'm in North Carolina. Cannabis is not legal and on any front. So not even on the medical front is cannabis legal here in our state. And so we have to get creative on what matrices we use as representative to cannabis. And one of those matrices that we use is oregano. So due to its similar waxy leaf-like structure to cannabis, it can be used as a representative matrix. So what I'm going to kind of do here is look at a totally different study than the spices study that I'm talking about here, and make that comparison that we can use the extraction of cannabis and how it behaved with cleanup and compare that back to how potentially oregano would run in that same setting. So I need to thank the Washington State Department of Agricultural Chemical and Hop Laboratory for allowing me, for first doing this data. They actually did this data on site there, and then allowing me to share it here today. We ran a very similar method to the method that we were showing here today in this presentation, but just made some very slight changes. One is in sample size. We were running 2 grams of the spices, and we ran 1.5 grams of the cannabis here. And then more importantly, we added sorbent for this study. We were using the contents of an Agilent's QUECHERS dispersive SPE tube. So we literally just took that tube, poured it into the Q cup, and then weighed our cannabis on top of that. So what you can see, though, is we got 100% recovery when we did this cleanup. So I would fully expect that if we ran the oregano with cleanup, that we'd see that 80% recovery jump up, and because we wouldn't have as many matrix effects going on for that. But still, I mean, that's up to your discretion, still getting very good results even without having to do that cleanup step. So before I conclude talking about spices, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about organic versus not organic, because I think for any of us, when we think about spices, or pesticides rather, that's probably what we're thinking about. You know, organic is just a hot topic. And certainly when I go to the grocery store and buy an organic substance, I would assume that that does not have any pesticides in it. I probably will not be making that assumption anymore. So with the data here, please note that I am not making any claims whatsoever regarding concentration, okay? We did not quantify this data. We're just simply saying trace amounts. I'm not making any claims of, amounts in there. Just simply saying there was enough present so that we could identify it. We could accurately say this is present, but that's it. I'm only claiming presence here. As I look at the 2 spices represented here, paprika and cinnamon, I first recognize that paprika, we have more components found in the organic versus the non-organic, but also that spinetoram kind of stands out to me because it's in every single one of them. Well, spinetoram is a very commonly used insecticide. In fact, you could go to your local Walmart and purchase some and use it in your home garden. So maybe not so surprising that we're seeing some of that hanging around. But the story isn't the same for the black pepper and oregano. We're actually seeing different subsets of pesticides, which is kind of interesting. And as I looked at this one set of data, it stood out to me that the pesticide that I saw now was that Pesticide. And if you remember back when I showed the data for the fungicides, one of the ones of concern was the Pesticide. So here, and that one was the acute toxin that is actually toxic to our birds and our bees. And in today's world, I think we all are aware of this bee epidemic that we're having, and we really do. I mean, it's important. We need to be protecting our bees. And here I am finding this substance that is potentially harmful to them in the spice that I bought at my local grocery store. So that is a little bit concerning. And then also, poor oregano. I'm probably not going to be spending my money on organic oregano anytime in the near future, given the fact that it certainly didn't shine compared to its non-organic counterpart. So with that, I am going to conclude talking about spices and move on to a different matrix. But what I hope you've seen, and again, I hope I'm not been too repetitive here, but being repetitive makes you remember. And so if you take anything away from this talk, I really want you to think back to the edge and see that it was a rapid, simple, and efficient technique. But even furthermore for these spices, it gave you better data than the traditional QUECHERS technique that we were running. So I've talked about difficult matrices. Spices definitely fall under that category, but that's a dry commodity, and in the world of foodstuff, there's obviously a very big difference from dry to wet. So I want to focus now on a wet food substance. And what we're going to look at is probably the most iconically used sample for QUECHERS, okay? Strawberries. It's pretty much what QUECHERS was designed for. And so I fully expect that QUECHERS should shine well for this particular type of sample. And so I am so thankful that in today's world, we're getting more and more CRMs available in the food sector. That has not always been the case. So it's great to be able to run a CRM. We all know that spiking, it's easier to extract something that was spiked than a pesticide that was incured. So with this development of food CRMs, it's just going to improve our data. And so that's really nice to be able to run a CRM. The method that we ran for the strawberries was the exact same method we ran on the spices. Okay, so we didn't do anything different as far as what we programmed in on the edge. The only changes we made was that in this case, we added 2.5 grams of absorbent and we increased our sample size to 5 grams. Now that absorbent is necessary because if we compare back to QUECHERS, that water in the strawberries is aiding in the extraction. It's necessary. So it's necessary for that extraction in the QUECHERS. However, on the edge, we need to remove it. We don't want that water there. We don't want that water getting into our extract and causing any issues with our analysis. So we're going to want to put something in our cell that is going to remove that water. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this sorbent that we used. CM is going to offer a Q matrix line, which is going to be sorbents designed for water removal and cleanup. So in this case, we're using a super absorbent that actually absorbs water at least 4 times better than traditional salts. So traditionally, if you were trying to remove water from something, you'd probably use magnesium sulfate or sodium sulfate in order to do that. But you need to use large quantities of that. And even then, you really struggle to remove the amount of water that would be present in a sample like strawberries. So that super absorbent we're going to use really enables us to have very simple sample preparation. You simply just add a little bit to the bottom of your cup. You just kind of spoon it in. Very efficient in the fact you only need a very small amount, and effective in the fact that it eliminates that need for salts, which on the edge adds even further complexities of needing extra washing and so forth. And then also it's doing what we need it to do, which is eliminating the water. So let's take a look then at the extract that we see here for strawberries. And what we see is that it's nice and clear. It's not cloudy. We don't have a water layer. We've been able to remove that water, which again, there's a lot of water in strawberry, and get a nice clean extract that we can go direct to analysis with. And if we look at the chromatogram of the pesticides that were present in the CRM, you see them here. I will note that I see that dimethoate and primacarb do coelute. However, they have completely different MRM transitions, so we can still quantify them with no problem. If we look at the data, we'll see that overall we got good recovery data for, and this is again, raw recovery of a CRM on the edge. So maybe as you're looking at this, you're probably like, I don't know, that toxazole looks a little bit low at 69%. But if we compare that then to QUECHERS, we actually see that we got a better recovery on the edge for the toxazole than we actually did on the QUECHERS. And that in general, and I would, again, QUECHERS was developed for this type of matrix, so I'd fully expect that it would perform well. And it did overall, right? We got 3 pesticides that were better on the edge, 3 that were better on QUECHERS. So this was a comparable technique here. But overall, I mean, what you have on the edge is that simple, efficient, and rapid technique, in the bonus the fact that you can get as good data, and in some cases better, right? If you look at it, the ones that are low on QUECHERS, that's the one where we're shining on the edge, and that overall our edge recoveries are 100% acceptable ranges. So with that, I am going to conclude my talk. And what I hope you've seen is that the edge achieved good recoveries and RSD values for extraction of pesticides from spices, but furthermore, that we got better recoveries than QUECHERS for those spices, and that we were able to get good recoveries for our strawberry puree CRM on the edge. And that, that final take home, right? The edge is that rapid, simple, and efficient alternative to the extraction of pesticides from really any food matrices. So certainly it is applicable to those difficult food matrices, but anything that you really want to run, I would hope that you consider the edge because it's going to give you all those advantages and help, going back to the very beginning, minimize that amount of time we're spending on sample preparation and take that into the modern world.